After some thought, she called the number back and agreed to meet in a safe, public place. A quiet coffee shop, not far from where they lived. The next day, they arrived, and there, sitting in the corner by the window, was the man Jake had helped, David. Looked different. He was still dressed simply, but something about him had changed. His posture was straighter, his eyes clearer. When he saw Jake, a broad smile spread across his face, and he quickly stood up. "Jake," he said warmly, his voice filled with emotion. "I can't believe it's really you." Jake smiled back, feeling a strange sense of familiarity, as if he had known David longer than just a single moment outside a store. They sat down, and David took a deep breath before speaking. "That day at the grocery store, I was at my lowest. I had lost my job, my home. I had nothing left. And when I reached into my wallet, knowing I didn't have enough money to buy even a loaf of bread, I felt completely hopeless." Jake listened intently, his young mind processing the weight of David's words. But then, David continued, his voice trembling. "You walked up to me. You gave me your allowance, something you could have spent on yourself, and you told me to buy food. That moment, that kindness, it changed everything." Jake's mother watched David closely, still unsure where this was going. David smiled, shaking his head in disbelief. "After that day, I made a decision. If a child could believe in kindness, why couldn't I? I took that money, and instead of spending it all, I used it as a sign to start over. I reached out to an old friend for help. He gave me a chance, a job. And from that one small moment, my life started changing." Jake's mother's eyes softened. She had been cautious, but now, hearing the story unfold, she saw the truth in David's eyes. But then, David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Jake. "This," he said, "is for you." Jake hesitated, glancing at his mom, who nodded slightly. Slowly, he unfolded the paper, and his eyes widened in shock. It was a check with his name on it, and the amount? It was far more than anything Jake had ever seen in his life. His hands trembled as he looked back at David. What is this?" David smiled. "It's my way of saying thank you. You gave me hope when I had nothing. Now I want to do something for you." Jake's mother gasped softly, covering her mouth. The number on the check wasn't small. It was enough to change their lives, in ways they hadn't even imagined. But Jake wasn't thinking about the money. He was thinking about the moment, about how one small act had led to something so big. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked up at David, speechless. And then, just when they thought the surprises were over, David spoke again. "This is only part of what I want to do," he said, "because I have one more thing that might change everything for you." Jake leaned in, anticipation swirling inside him. David took a deep breath. "Jake, how would you feel about a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity?" Jake and his mother exchanged glances, both holding their breath, and in that moment, they had no idea just how much their lives were about to change forever. Jake's mother couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her chest. The phone call from the man named David kept replaying in her mind. His voice had been sincere, almost desperate, but she was still wary. As a mother, her first instinct was to protect her son. No matter what, she knew Jake had done something kind, something selfless. But what if this was some kind of trick? What if trusting a stranger led them into something dangerous? That night, as she tucked Jake into bed, she sat on the edge of his blanket and brushed his hair back gently. "Are you sure you want to meet him?" she asked. "We don't really know him." Jake looked up at her, his young face full of trust and curiosity. "I know, Mom, but I don't think he's bad. He sounded nice, didn't he?" She sighed, feeling torn between caution and the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was something good. "All right," she finally said, "but we're meeting in public, and I'll be right there with you." The next afternoon, they drove to the small cafe where David had asked to meet. Jake swung his legs under the chair, looking around curiously. His mother sat beside him, her back straight, eyes scanning the room for any signs of trouble. Then the cafe door opened, and in walked David. He looked different from the last time they had seen him. Gone were the tired eyes and the slouched shoulders. He had cleaned up, put on a neat button-down shirt, and walked with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. But when he spotted Jake, the same warmth lit up his face. "Jake," he said, approaching the table. "I can't believe it's really you." Jake grinned. "Hi, sir." It all started with a small act of kindness, a simple gesture that at the time seemed like nothing more than a moment of generosity. But what this young boy didn't know was that his decision to help a stranger would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. Meet Jake, a 12-year-old with a big heart. Like most kids his age, he had a weekly allowance, money he could spend on toys, snacks, or whatever he wanted. But Jake wasn't just any kid. He had always been taught by his parents that kindness matters, that even the smallest good deeds could make a difference. One afternoon, Jake and his mom stopped by a small grocery store on their way home from school. As they walked toward the entrance, Jake noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. A man, dressed in worn-out clothes, was standing near the store, looking down at his empty wallet. His face was tired, his eyes filled with worry. He hesitated at the entrance, then turned away, clearly struggling with something inside. Jake didn't know this man. He didn't know his story, where he came from, or what had led him to this moment. But he could see the pain in his eyes. And, in that instant, without even thinking twice, Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out his entire week's allowance. He walked up to the man, his heart pounding, and held out the crumpled bills. "Here, sir," he said softly. "You can buy some food." The man looked down at Jake, his eyes widening in surprise. He opened his mouth as if to say something but stopped. For a moment, he just stared at the boy, then at the money in his hand. Finally, his lips trembled into a smile. One of those rare, heartfelt smiles that carry more emotion than words ever could. "Thank you," the man whispered, his voice shaky. "You don't know how much this means to me." Jake smiled back, feeling a warmth spread in his chest. It felt good to help someone. It felt right. His mom, watching from a few feet away, was silent. She had always taught Jake to be kind. But this moment, this pure, selfless act, left her speechless. She placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, proud but also wondering about the man they had just helped. As they walked into the store, Jake didn't think much more about it. He had done what he felt was right, and that was enough for him. But what he didn't realize was that his simple act of kindness had been noticed, and in the days that followed, something incredible was about to happen. At first, everything seemed normal. Jake went back to school, played with his friends, and did his homework as usual. But then, something strange started happening. One afternoon, his mom got a phone call from an unknown number. She answered hesitantly, and a deep voice spoke on the other end. "Is this Jake's mother?" She felt a sudden rush of concern. "Yes. Who is this?" There was a brief pause before the voice continued. "My name is David. I'm calling about your son. I need to meet him. Please, it's important." Her heart skipped a beat. "Why? What is this about?" The man hesitated. Because he changed my life. And now I want to change his. And that's when everything took a turn. No one saw coming. Jake's mother tightened her grip on the phone, a mix of confusion and concern washing over her. A stranger was asking to meet her son. Her heart raced with questions. Who was this man? What did he mean when he said Jake had changed his life? She hesitated, her protective instincts kicking in. How do you know my son? She asked, her voice firm but cautious. There was silence for a moment. Then the voice on the other end softened. He helped me when no one else did. That boy. He saw me when the world didn't. I need to see him. Please. Her mind flashed back to that day at the grocery store. To the man Jake had helped. Could it be him? She took a deep breath. Torn. Between her instinct to protect her child and the sincerity in the man's voice. Let me think about it, she finally said, keeping her tone measured. I'll call you back. After she hung up, she sat down with Jake, searching his face for any sign of worry. But he was just curious. Who was that? He asked. A man named David, she said carefully. He says you helped him. Jake's eyes lit up with recognition. Is it the man from the grocery store? She nodded, watching his reaction closely. But there was no fear in his expression, only excitement and a bit of wonder. What does he want? Jake asked. He wants to meet you again. Jake thought about that for a moment, then smiled. I think we should. His mother hesitated. Everything in her told her to be careful, to be sure. But something in Jake's face, in his confidence, made her pause. Maybe this was bigger than she understood. David let out a soft chuckle. You don't have to call me sir. Just David is fine. He turned to Jake's mother, his expression growing serious. Thank you for coming. I know this must have felt strange to you, but I had to see you both. Again. Jake's mother studied him closely. We're here, she said carefully. Now tell us, why did you want to meet my son? David took a deep breath, looking down at his hands for a moment before speaking. Because he changed my life. His voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it. That day at the grocery store, I had nothing. I wasn't just broke. I had lost everything. My job, my home, my sense of purpose. I had no one left to turn to. Jake sat still, listening intently. David continued, his voice thick with emotion. I was standing outside that store, wondering how I was going to make it through the next day. And then, this boy, your son, walked up to me and gave me his allowance. No hesitation, no questions, just pure kindness. Jake's mother swallowed. Hard. She had seen her son's generous spirit before, but she hadn't realized just how much impact one small moment could have on someone. David smiled softly. That act reminded me that the world wasn't as dark as I thought. It gave me the push I needed. I took that money and made a decision. I was going to fight for myself again. I reached out to an old friend, someone who had once offered me work. He gave me a second chance. I got a job, a place to stay, and slowly, I started rebuilding. Jake beamed. That's awesome. David chuckled. It is, and it's because of you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Which is why I want to do something in return. Jake took the envelope hesitantly and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper. When he unfolded it, his eyes widened. It was a check, one with his name on it. Jake's mother's breath hitched as she read the amount. It wasn't just a small thank you gesture. It was enough to make a real difference in their lives. What is this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David smiled. It's my way of paying it forward. I got back on my feet, and I want to help Jake, the way he helped me. He looked at Jake, his expression sincere. You didn't give me money, Jake. You gave me hope, and that's something I can never repay." Jake's hands shook slightly as he held the check. He had never seen so much money before. But even as excitement bubbled inside him, something else tugged at his heart. "I don't know if I can take this," Jake said hesitantly. Looking up at his mother, David nodded, as if he had expected that. "That's up to you. But I want you to know, this isn't just money. It's an opportunity. It can help you in ways you haven't even imagined." Yet, Jake's mother was speechless. She had struggled for years to provide for Jake, doing everything she could to give him a good life. And now, out of nowhere, a door had opened that she never expected. But then, David reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a small, neatly folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. "This," he said, "is something else. Something that could change your future even more." Jake hesitated before picking it up and unfolding it. His eyes scanned the words, his heart pounding harder with each second. And then he looked up at David, completely stunned. His mother read over his shoulder, her own eyes going wide. Because this wasn't just another check. It was something even bigger, something that could change everything. And in that moment, neither of them knew whether they were ready for it.